The letter arrived on the coldest morning of the year. Eleanor almost missed it. It had slipped beneath the front door sometime during the night, resting quietly on the wooden floorboards of the cottage while the fire burned low in the hearth. Outside, snow drifted softly across the fields. The world beyond the frosted windows looked pale and distant, as though the entire countryside had been wrapped in white silk. Inside the cottage, everything was still. The clock ticked, the kettle whispered, and beside the small kitchen window, Eleanor stood wrapped in her old wool cardigan, staring at the envelope in her hands. There was no stamp, no address, no name except her own, written carefully in fading ink. Eleanor. She traced the letters with her thumb. The handwriting felt strangely familiar. Not familiar in the ordinary way, not the kind of familiarity that belonged to recent years. This felt older, softer, like the memory of a song once sung beside candlelight. For a long moment, she simply stood there listening to the wind brush against the cottage walls. Then slowly, she opened the letter. Inside was only a single sentence. "The garden is waiting for you." Nothing more. No signature. No explanation. Just those 6 words. Eleanor lowered the page, and somewhere deep beneath years of silence and routine, something stirred. Because behind the cottage, beyond the frozen stone path and the sleeping orchard, there had once been a garden. A real garden. Not merely rows of herbs or flowers, but a place her grandmother had loved with unusual devotion. A place filled with lanterns and rosemary and old stories told beneath climbing ivy. A place Eleanor had not entered in nearly 12 years. The thought alone made her chest tighten gently. She folded the letter, placed it into the pocket of her cardigan, and looked toward the back window. Snow covered everything now. Still, beneath the white fields, beneath winter itself, she could almost imagine the garden waiting there, quietly, patiently, as though it had known she would return. The path behind the cottage had nearly disappeared. Eleanor stepped carefully through the snow, her boots sinking softly with each step. Bare branches trembled overhead. The orchard trees stood motionless in the pale morning light, their limbs silver with frost. She had not walked this way in years, not since the spring after her grandmother passed away. After that, the garden had slowly become something easier to avoid than to face. At first, Eleanor told herself she was simply busy. There had been work, life, seasons moving too quickly. But the truth was quieter than that. The garden remembered too much. Every stone carried echoes. Every corner held a version of herself she no longer knew how to be. The child who laughed beside lavender bushes. The teenager who listened to stories under lantern light. The young woman who believed some places could keep sorrow away forever. Winter air brushed gently across her cheeks. Ahead, beneath the snowfall, the old iron gate slowly appeared. Eleanor stopped. The gate leaned slightly now. Rust traced delicate patterns along the metal, but the shape remained unmistakable. Her grandmother had once painted tiny stars along the arch above it. Most had faded. A few still remained. Eleanor reached forward carefully. The metal felt cold beneath her fingertips. Then, with a soft creak that seemed to wake the silence around her, the gate opened. The garden lay beyond, sleeping. Winter had softened everything. Snow rested over the stone paths. The herb beds had become gentle white hills. The fountain at the center stood frozen beneath hanging ivy. And yet, even now, the garden felt alive, not in movement, not in sound, but in presence, as though the place itself had been breathing quietly through all the years she stayed away. Eleanor stepped inside. Immediately, memory returned, not as thoughts, as sensations. The smell of rosemary warmed by summer sunlight, the glow of lanterns swinging in evening wind, her grandmother's voice saying, "Gardens remember the people who love them." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she noticed something strange. Near the center fountain, where snow should have remained untouched, there was a single line of footprints. Fresh footprints. Her breath caught. Someone had been here. Recently. Slowly, carefully she followed them. The footprints curved around the frozen fountain and disappeared toward the far side of the garden where the greenhouse stood. Or rather, where it used to stand. Years ago, a storm had shattered most of the glass roof. Eleanor remembered helping her grandmother gather broken pieces from the wet earth. She remembered rain and candlelight, and her grandmother smiling gently despite the damage. Things do not stop being beautiful because they are broken, she had said. Now, standing in the winter silence, Eleanor saw that the greenhouse still remained. Older, weathered, covered in climbing ivy, but standing. One warm light glowed faintly inside. Eleanor froze. Someone was there. Snow drifted softly around her. The entire garden seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly, she walked toward the light. The greenhouse door stood slightly open. Warm air slipped gently into the cold afternoon. Eleanor paused before entering. She could smell earth, fresh herbs, and something sweeter beneath it. Chamomile, perhaps. The scent instantly transported her backward through time. For one impossible moment, she was 12 years old again, sitting cross-legged beside terracotta pots, while her grandmother hummed softly somewhere nearby. Eleanor pushed the door wider. The hinges creaked quietly. Inside, golden light flickered across rows of plants. Candles glowed from hanging shelves. Tiny green leaves reached upward from clay pots. And near the far window, someone stood carefully trimming rosemary stems. A man in his late 30s, dark wavy hair curling softly near the collar of a weathered wool coat. He turned slowly at the sound. For a long moment, Neither of them spoke. Then the man smiled. Not with surprise, almost with recognition. "You came back," he said softly. Eleanor stared at him. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Do I know you?" The man set the rosemary aside. "No," he answered gently. "But your grandmother spoke of you often." The words settled into the room like falling snow. Eleanor looked around. The greenhouse no longer felt abandoned. Someone had cared for this place. Recently, carefully. "You knew my grandmother?" The man nodded. "My name is Samuel." He motioned toward a nearby chair. "She asked me to look after the garden if she was ever unable to." Eleanor's heartbeat slowed strangely. "Why didn't I ever meet you?" Samuel smiled faintly. "Because some promises are meant to wait until the proper season." Outside, snow drifted softly against the glass. The greenhouse glowed like a lantern in the middle of winter. Eleanor removed her gloves slowly. Something about the warmth of the room loosened the distance she had carried for years. Samuel poured tea into 2 small ceramic cups. "Chamomile," he said. Eleanor accepted the cup carefully. Steam curled upward between them. "She left something for you," Samuel continued. From a nearby shelf, he lifted a small wooden box. The wood had darkened with age. Tiny flowers were carved along the lid. Eleanor recognized it instantly. Her grandmother used to keep seeds inside. But when Samuel handed it to her, she realized it was heavier than she remembered. Inside were letters, dozens of them, folded neatly with ribbon. Eleanor looked up. "What are these?" Samuel's expression softened. "She wrote one for every year you stayed away." Silence filled the greenhouse. Outside, the wind moved gently through the sleeping orchard. Eleanor touched the top letter with trembling fingers. The paper was worn softly at the edges. On the front, written in familiar ink, were 4 words: "For when winter feels endless." Eleanor swallowed carefully. Then she opened the first letter. The handwriting carried warmth, not merely in style, but in rhythm, as though each sentence had been written beside candlelight during long evenings of patient waiting. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then perhaps the garden has finally called you home." Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. The greenhouse disappeared around her. All she could see was the page. "I know you believe you left because of grief, but grief is not what keeps people away from beautiful places. Fear does that." Snow tapped softly against the glass roof. Samuel quietly returned to tending the herbs, giving her the privacy of silence. Eleanor continued reading. "You feared the garden would remind you of loss. But memory is not loss, my darling. Memory is the way love remains visible after everything else changes." Eleanor closed her eyes. For years she had avoided this place, believing it would hurt too much. And perhaps it had. But sitting in the greenhouse now, wrapped in candlelight and chamomile steam, she realized something unexpected. The memories were not sharp. They were gentle, like old music drifting through another room. She kept reading. There is something I never told you. The garden was never built to grow flowers. Eleanor frowned slightly. It was built to help people return to themselves. A small ache rose in her chest. She remembered now how strangers sometimes visited during summer evenings, how her grandmother would walk with them beneath the lanterns, how people always seemed quieter when they left, lighter somehow, not healed completely, but less alone. The letter continued. Every path in the garden was designed for slowing down. Every herb was planted for comfort. Every lantern was hung to remind weary people that light still exists, even after difficult seasons. Eleanor's fingers rested against the paper. Outside the greenhouse windows, winter stretched endlessly across the fields. Yet inside, warmth glowed softly against the darkness. The final lines were shorter. One day you will understand that the garden was never asking you to remember me. It was asking you to remember yourself. Love, always, grandmother. Eleanor lowered the page slowly. The room had become very quiet. Samuel approached carefully. She loved you very much, he said. Eleanor nodded, but tears had already begun slipping silently down her cheeks. Not heavy tears, not broken ones. The kind that arrive when something frozen finally begins to thaw. That evening, Samuel invited her to stay for supper. The storm outside had grown stronger. Snow drifted thickly across the orchard, turning the world beyond the greenhouse into silver fog. Inside the cottage, the fire crackled warmly. Samuel moved slowly around the kitchen, preparing soup from herbs gathered in the greenhouse. Rosemary, thyme, parsley. The scents filled the small room with comforting warmth. Eleanor sat near the window, watching snow gather along the garden walls. It felt strange sharing the cottage with another person, and stranger still that Samuel seemed to fit naturally into the quiet spaces her grandmother once occupied. Not as replacement. Nothing could replace her, but as continuation, as though the garden itself had chosen someone gentle enough to remain after she was gone. You kept all of this alive, Eleanor said softly. Samuel smiled faintly while stirring the soup. Not alone. She looked toward him. The garden helps. Eleanor almost laughed, yet something in his expression stopped her. Not because she believed the garden was magical, but because some places truly do shape the people who care for them. This place had shaped her grandmother. Perhaps it had shaped Samuel too. And perhaps, once upon a time, It had shaped Eleanor. After supper, Samuel brought another bundle of letters. "These are different," he explained. "She asked you to read them in the garden itself." Eleanor glanced toward the dark windows. "Tonight?" Samuel nodded. "The lantern path." A memory stirred immediately. The lantern path. Her favorite part of the garden. Stone steps winding beneath climbing ivy, where dozens of lanterns once glowed during summer nights. Her grandmother used to light them one by one at dusk. Eleanor remembered the sound of crickets, the scent of jasmine, the feeling that the world beyond the garden had disappeared entirely. Samuel handed her a lantern. "Some paths are easier to understand at night," he said. The storm had softened. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the darkness as Eleanor stepped back into the garden. The lantern in her hand cast warm golden circles across the snow-covered stones. Everything looked transformed. Winter no longer felt empty. The garden glowed softly beneath the night sky. Samuel had relit several hanging lanterns along the ivy arches. Their warm light shimmered gently against the falling snow. Eleanor followed the old path slowly. Each step awakened another memory. Summer evenings, laughter, music drifting from the cottage windows, and always her grandmother walking calmly ahead, with lantern lights surrounding her like stars. Near the center of the path stood a wooden bench. The bench remained exactly where it had always been. Even the faded blanket draped across one side looked familiar. Eleanor sat carefully. The garden around her breathed with quiet stillness. From the bundle, she selected another letter. This one read, "For the nights you feel forgotten." She opened it slowly. Loneliness can be very convincing. The letter began, "It whispers that you have become invisible to the world." Eleanor stared at the page while snow settled softly around her boots. "But listen carefully, my darling. Trees do not stop recognizing spring simply because winter lasted longer than expected." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. That sounded exactly like her grandmother. Gentle wisdom wrapped inside strange gardening metaphors. She continued reading. "You are not behind in life. You are not too late to begin again. And you are not less worthy of love because difficult years changed you." The lantern beside her flickered warmly. Somewhere in the darkness, wind moved through frozen branches. Eleanor realized suddenly how tired she had become over the years. Not physically, soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that arrives quietly after carrying disappointment for too long. Working, existing, repeating routines, forgetting how to feel wonder. The letter continued. "One day you will discover that healing rarely arrives all at once. More often, it returns slowly, like lanterns appearing one by one along a dark path. Eleanor lowered the page. Around her, the garden glowed softly beneath snowfall. One lantern, then another, then another. A pathway of quiet light. For the first time in years, she no longer felt like she was standing outside her own life. She felt present, truly present. The feeling was so unfamiliar that it almost frightened her. Yet beneath the fear was something warmer. Hope. Small, fragile, but alive. Over the following days, Eleanor remained at the cottage. The storm passed. Winter sunlight returned. And slowly, the garden began changing her. Not dramatically, not through sudden revelations, through small things. Morning tea inside the greenhouse, pruning rosemary beside Samuel, sweeping snow from the stone paths, lighting lanterns at dusk. The rhythms of the garden slowed her thoughts. Days no longer rushed past unnoticed. She began sleeping more deeply, breathing more slowly, remembering simple pleasures she had abandoned somewhere along the way. One afternoon, while repairing broken terracotta pots beside the greenhouse, Eleanor asked Samuel a question that had lingered quietly in her mind. "Why did my grandmother choose you?" Samuel smiled thoughtfully. "I think," he said slowly, "because I once needed the garden too." Eleanor waited. Snow melted softly from the greenhouse roof. Years ago, Samuel explained, he had arrived at the cottage during autumn, alone, grieving. He had lost his wife after many years together. Afterward, the world no longer felt recognizable. Days became heavy, silence unbearable. Then one evening, wandering without direction, he encountered the garden glowing beneath lantern light. "Your grandmother invited me inside," he said. Eleanor could picture it perfectly. Her grandmother opening the gate without hesitation, offering tea before questions. Samuel continued. She never tried to fix grief. He brushed soil gently from his hands. She simply made space for it. The words settled deeply inside Eleanor, because perhaps that was what the garden had always done. Not erase pain, not cure loneliness, only soften the sharpest edges long enough for people to rest. That evening, Eleanor wandered through the garden alone. The snow had begun melting from the herb beds. Tiny hints of green appeared beneath winter's fading grip. Near the old sundial, she noticed something growing through the frost. Lavender, small, delicate, alive. She knelt carefully beside it. The scent was faint, but unmistakable. Instantly, she remembered her grandmother's hands brushing gently across lavender stems during summer harvest. Even sleeping gardens dream of spring, she used to say. Eleanor smiled softly. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt like an empty hallway. It felt like a season waiting quietly beneath the snow. Weeks passed. Winter slowly loosened its hold on the countryside. The orchard trees began catching warmer light. Birdsong returned in hesitant fragments each morning. And throughout the garden, life awakened. Chamomile, mint, rosemary. Green shoots pushed carefully through dark soil, as though the earth itself had grown hopeful again. Eleanor worked beside Samuel each day, repairing paths, cleaning lanterns, replanting herbs. Sometimes they spoke for hours, sometimes not at all. The silence between them felt comfortable. One evening near sunset, Samuel handed Eleanor a final letter. "This is the last one," he said. The envelope was older than the others. The paper had softened with time. On the front were written 6 familiar words. "For when you are ready to stay." Eleanor sat beneath the ivy arch while dusk settled gently across the garden. Lanterns glowed softly overhead. She opened the letter. "My dearest Eleanor, if you have reached this final letter, then perhaps you already understand what I hoped the garden would teach you." Warm wind moved softly through the ivy. Life becomes very loud sometimes. People rush. They forget how to listen, forget how to notice beauty, forget how to rest. Eleanor looked around the garden, the lanterns, the herbs, the quiet paths. All of it had been designed for remembering. Not the past, the self. She continued reading. "The world will always ask you to become harder. Please do not confuse hardness with strength." Tears gathered again, softly this time. There is enormous courage in remaining gentle. The last lines were written more faintly. "If the garden still feels like home to you, then perhaps it is because home was never a place. It was the version of yourself you were able to become here. Love always, grandmother." Eleanor lowered the page slowly. Dusk deepened around the garden. Lanterns shimmered like stars beneath the darkening sky. And somewhere nearby, Samuel lit another candle inside the greenhouse. For a long moment, Eleanor simply sat there listening. Wind through ivy, distant birdsong, the gentle breathing of the garden itself. Then quietly, almost without realizing it, she understood. The letters had never been instructions. They had been invitations. Invitations to return, to slow down, to notice life again, to become soft enough to feel wonder, and perhaps most importantly, to stop treating healing like a destination, because healing was this: lantern light, warm tea, fresh rosemary, snow melting from garden paths, small beautiful moments patiently gathered together, like seeds waiting beneath winter. Spring arrived slowly, but it arrived. The orchard blossomed first. Pale petals drifted across the garden paths like falling silk. Then came the lavender, the chamomile, the climbing jasmine winding once again around the greenhouse walls. Visitors slowly returned too. Travelers, neighbors. weary strangers passing through the countryside. Some arrived carrying grief, others exhaustion. Some simply needed silence. Eleanor welcomed them gently through the iron gate. Tea waited inside the greenhouse. Lanterns glowed each evening, and the garden continued doing what it had always done, offering rest. One twilight evening, Eleanor stood beside the fountain watching petals drift across the water. The air smelled of rosemary and rain. Samuel approached quietly beside her. "You've changed the garden," he said. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I think the garden changed me first." Lanterns flickered softly beneath the deepening blue sky. Somewhere nearby, a visitor laughed quietly during conversation. The sound filled the garden with warmth. Eleanor looked upward. For years she had believed peace was something distant, something difficult, something other people discovered while she merely endured life. But now she understood. Peace was often built from very small things. A warm window during winter, a familiar voice, a lantern glowing in darkness, a garden waiting patiently for someone to come home. The evening wind moved gently through the lavender, and beneath the first stars of spring, Eleanor finally felt it completely. Not the ending of sorrow, not perfect happiness, something quieter, a sense of belonging inside her own life again. The garden glowed warmly around her, alive with memory, alive with light, alive with gentle, unfinished hope. And somewhere beyond the lanterns and ivy and drifting spring blossoms, the future waited, not frightening, not empty, only unwritten, like a path disappearing softly into moonlit flowers, inviting her forward, one peaceful step at a time.